Everything you know about the ancient world came from a textbook written by someone who also just guessed. 40 seconds of trust, and they had you. Let's fix that now. 1. You've been told your entire life that the pyramids were built by enslaved people, whipped, brutalized laborers dragging limestone blocks under a merciless sun while a tyrant watched from a throne. Every Hollywood production agrees. Every casual dinner table conversation repeats it, and every single one of them is wrong. The pyramid builders were paid, skilled laborers who received medical care, ate well, and were buried with honor near the very monuments they built. Zahi Hawass and his team excavated the workers' village at Giza in the 1990s and uncovered bakeries, breweries, and a dedicated cemetery. Infrastructure that signals an organized workforce, not a slave camp. Skeletal analysis of the remains revealed healed fractures, meaning workers received active medical attention. No slave society in history has bothered setting broken bones on the people it considers property. Administrative papyri from the period, including the Merer Diary, the oldest known papyrus, describe rotating work gangs with names like Friends of Khufu, organized into competing teams with recorded rations that varied by skill level. These were not victims. They were specialists operating inside a formal labor economy. Graffiti discovered in sealed construction chambers carries boastful team names like Drunkards of Menkar, which is not the language of people living under terror. The slave builder story was popularized by Herodotus, a Greek tourist writing roughly 2,000 years after construction ended, who got most of his ancient Egyptian information spectacularly wrong and was working from rumor, not documentation. You've been crediting the greatest engineering achievement in human history to a forced labor system that didn't build it, which is roughly equivalent to crediting the invention of flight to people who were afraid of heights. 2. Cleopatra is ancient Egypt's most iconic figure. Painted eyes, Mediterranean mystique, the absolute face of pharaonic civilization in the popular imagination. She is Egypt, except she almost certainly wasn't Egyptian. Cleopatra VII was in all likelihood of Macedonian Greek descent, a product of the Ptolemaic dynasty founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a family that aggressively maintained its Greek identity for 3 centuries through a marriage strategy so internally focused it made sibling unions a dynasty tradition. The Ptolemaic line began with Ptolemy Soter in 305 BC, and for nearly 10 generations the family married almost exclusively within itself to preserve their Macedonian bloodline. Cleopatra's descendants is the first member of her dynasty known to have bothered learning the Egyptian language, which is either admirably culturally curious or damning evidence that everyone before her simply didn't care to. Her mother's identity is genuinely unknown, which opens a slim possibility of non-Greek ancestry, but the dominant scholarly consensus places her firmly within the Hellenistic tradition. Her court language was Greek, her philosophical framework was Greek. She worshipped syncretized Greek-Egyptian deities, but operated from a Greek cultural architecture. Coins minted during her reign depict a woman with strong Hellenistic features that bear little resemblance to the Hollywood archetype the world has collectively agreed upon. Egypt at the time was essentially a Greek-speaking, Greek-governed territory that happened to occupy African geography. A complexity that the shorthand "she was Egyptian" erases entirely. Calling Cleopatra Egyptian because she ruled Egypt is like calling a colonial governor native to the land he administered because he spent his career there. Geography is not identity, the map is not the person, and 2,000 years of iconography is not a genealogy. 3. Open the tomb and die within months. The curse of the pharaohs is practically historical fact at this point. A supernatural warning system engineered into Egyptian burial chambers to protect the dead from disturbance. It is also a press invention built almost entirely on survivorship bias, selective memory, and the death of one elderly man who was already ill when he arrived in Egypt. Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the 1922 excavation, died 5 months after the tomb's opening. From an infected mosquito bite he nicked while shaving. He was 57 years old, in chronically poor health, and had been in fragile condition for years before he ever set foot near Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Howard Carter, the archaeologist who actually entered the tomb first and touched everything inside it, lived for another 17 years after the opening. If the curse had a targeting system, it was catastrophically imprecise. A 2002 study published in the British Medical Journal examined the death dates of 44 people associated with the tomb's discovery and found no statistically significant difference in survival compared to people who had never been anywhere near it. The curse inscription most people can quote, warning death upon those who disturb the pharaoh, was almost entirely fabricated by newspapers. The actual inscriptions inside the tomb are protective spells written for the deceased, not threats directed at the living. Arthur Conan Doyle, already deep in his spiritualism obsession at the time, enthusiastically told reporters that deaths were supernatural in origin, and the press ran with it without pausing to ask whether the man who invented a fictional detective was the appropriate source for scientific conclusions. Tomb excavations were enormously popular in the early 20th century. Statistically, some participants were going to die. The ones who did became legend. The ones who lived got no headlines. The curse didn't kill anyone. The headlines did the rest. 4. Mummies exist because ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death and wanted to perfectly preserve the body for the soul's return journey. It is a religious ritual, full stop. Except it wasn't, not entirely. Mummification served overlapping purposes: religious, political, economic, and technical. And the Egyptians understood decomposition well enough to treat preservation as a discipline, not merely a spiritual gesture. The full, elaborate mummification process took 70 days and was performed by a specialized class of embalmers who operated in organized workshops. This was an industry, not a temple ceremony. The process began with the removal of internal organs stored separately in canopic jars. The brain was extracted through the nasal cavity and largely discarded because the Egyptians considered it irrelevant to identity. The heart, not the brain, was understood as the seat of intelligence and selfhood. Natron salt, not prayer, was the primary preservation agent, a naturally occurring compound that desiccated the body by drawing out moisture, a scientifically coherent dehydration technique with no supernatural component. Mummification was also a status display. Wealthy families purchased the premium package: fine linen wrappings, protective amulets, gilded masks. Poor Egyptians were buried in desert sand, which often accidentally mummified them through natural desiccation anyway, achieving similar results without the invoice. Animal mummification was a massive commercial enterprise. Millions of cats, ibises, crocodiles, and baboons were mummified as votive offerings purchased by worshippers and donated to temples. This was ancient religious merchandising operating at industrial scale. CT scanning of surviving mummies has revealed evidence of sophisticated surgical knowledge, dietary patterns, parasitic infections, and cancer. Information preserved because the technique was high quality enough to hold biological data across millennia. The Egyptians built an entire biotechnology industry around death, and we summarized it as, they really liked the afterlife. Imagine future civilizations finding a refrigerator and concluding the 21st century was simply obsessed with cold. 5. Ancient Egyptians worshipped cats as gods. Cat people have been citing this as cosmic validation for decades. The image is everywhere. Egyptians bowing before felines, building temples to their pets, treating every stray as a divine being in a fur coat. Here's the actual distinction the ancient Egyptians understood perfectly well, and that modern pop culture has completely collapsed. There is a meaningful theological difference between associated with divine qualities and literally is a god. And Egyptian religious thought was sophisticated enough to know which one it was doing. The goddess Bastet was depicted with a cat's head, but she was a goddess who took feline form, not a cat that happened to be worshipped. Egyptians were nuanced polytheists, not a civilization that confused its pest control with its pantheon. Cats earned their reverence practically first. They killed rodents that threatened grain supplies and hunted snakes, making them economically essential in an agricultural civilization. Religious status followed utility, which is a pattern that appears repeatedly in ancient cultures. Killing a cat, even accidentally, carried serious legal consequences, and the city of Bubastis held enormous annual festivals honoring Bastet where, according to contemporary accounts, vast crowds gathered, made offerings, and celebrated with documented enthusiasm. That's civic festivity honoring a deity associated with feline qualities, not a civilization kneeling before its house pets. Domestic cats were likely first tamed in Egypt or the broader Near East precisely because of this agricultural relationship. Humans and cats had a mutually beneficial arrangement that the culture then formalized into religious significance over time. The conflation of sacred with God is a modern flattening of a complex theological relationship into a meme. Saying Egyptians worshipped cats as gods because they held them sacred is like saying modern people worship money as a deity because they build institutions around it and panic when it disappears. Reverence and divinity are different categories, and the Egyptians knew the difference. 6. Hieroglyphics were the writing system of ancient Egypt, so naturally, Egyptians used hieroglyphics to write everything. Letters, contracts, shopping lists, administrative records. Except they didn't, and the idea that they did reflects a confusion between a civilization's formal monumental script and its functional daily communication. Hieroglyphics were ceremonial. They appeared on temples, tombs, and monuments. For everything else, Egyptians used completely different writing systems that most people have never heard of, because they don't appear on the things that get photographed and put in museums. Hieratic script was a cursive simplified form developed almost simultaneously with hieroglyphics and used for administrative documents, literary texts, letters, and records from the earliest dynasties onward. It's what a working scribe actually reached for when he needed to write something down quickly and efficiently. Demotic script emerged around 650 BC as an even further abbreviated form, used for commercial and legal documents, faster, less elaborate, entirely practical. Hieroglyphics were so labor-intensive and skill-dependent that carving or painting them correctly required years of specialized training. They were the formal dress of the writing world, worn only on appropriate ceremonial occasions, never to the market. The Rosetta Stone makes this structure explicit. It contains the same decree written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics for priests, Demotic for general Egyptian audiences, and Ancient Greek for the colonial administration. A trilingual acknowledgement of the different linguistic registers operating simultaneously in the same society. Literacy in hieroglyphics was limited to probably under 1% of the population. The scribal class guarded this knowledge deliberately, because exclusivity was part of its professional value. The word hieroglyphics is itself Greek for sacred carved letters. Even the Greeks understood these were formal inscriptions, not everyday tools. Using hieroglyphics for daily communication would be like insisting on writing every grocery list in hand-illuminated calligraphy on vellum. The formal system exists for permanence. Everyone uses a shorthand when they actually need to get something done. 7. Napoleon's soldiers used the Great Sphinx for artillery target practice during the Egyptian campaign of 1798, blasting off its nose in an act of colonial destruction that history has quietly preferred not to dwell on. It is a satisfying story. It is also chronologically impossible, because the nose was already gone before Napoleon was born. The Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden sketched the Sphinx in 1737, more than 60 years before Napoleon's forces arrived in Egypt, and his drawings clearly show the nose missing. This predates the French campaign by over half a century, which makes Napoleon's culpability difficult to maintain even for the most committed accusers. Medieval Arab historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, attributed the damage to a religious figure named Muhammad Sa'i Maldar, who allegedly attacked the Sphinx's face in 1378 AD to protest local peasants making agricultural offerings to the monument. According to the account, he was subsequently killed by the local population for the act. The original nose was approximately 1.5 meters long, substantial enough that its removal required deliberate effort, not gradual weather erosion. Physical evidence of drill holes remaining in the Sphinx's face suggests the nose was pried off using rods or chisels rather than blown away by any projectile. Napoleon actually made significant contributions to the scholarly documentation of Egypt through his campaign. He brought 160 academics with him, producing the multi-volume Description de l'Egypte, a foundational text of the field. The Napoleon story survives, partly because it fits a clean anti-colonial narrative, and partly because assigning blame to a famous French general is dramatically more satisfying than a complicated medieval account involving local religious conflict. Napoleon did considerable damage to the world through other means. There's no need to give him credit for this particular one. 8. As Rome burned in 64 AD, Nero stood on a tower playing his fiddle and singing about the fall of Troy while his citizens died in the streets below. The image is so vivid and so frequently repeated that it feels like documented history. It has two obvious problems. The fiddle did not exist for approximately another 1,000 years, and Nero was probably not in Rome when the fire started. The violin family of instruments didn't develop in Europe until the Middle Ages, with the first recognizable fiddles appearing around the 9th to 10th century AD, roughly 900 years after Nero's death. He literally could not have played it. The instrument associated with Nero in the actual ancient accounts was the kithara, a large complex lyre requiring both hands and serious musical training. He reportedly did play it and performed publicly, which his contemporaries considered embarrassing for an emperor, not evidence of pyromania. The historian Tacitus, the most reliable ancient source for this period, states that Nero was at his villa in Antium, approximately 35 miles from Rome, when the fire broke out. He reportedly returned to the city and opened his gardens and public buildings as relief shelters for displaced citizens. Some ancient sources, including Tacitus himself, note that rumors persisted that Nero ordered the fire set, but Tacitus also records that contemporaries were uncertain whether to believe it. The "fiddling while Rome burns" phrase likely evolved from a garbled version of a different account, that Nero sang of Troy's burning while watching the flames from a tower, combined with a later anachronistic instrument substitution that no one bothered to fact-check. You've spent 2,000 years furious at a man for playing an instrument that didn't exist yet. If you're going to convict someone in the history's court, the least you can do is use a real murder weapon. 9. Wealthy Romans built dedicated vomiting rooms called vomitoria at their feasts, where guests would excuse themselves between courses, purge, and return to keep eating. It is the definitive image of Roman excess, decadence made architecturally permanent. It is also a complete misidentification of what a vomitorium actually is. Vomitoria are real architectural features of Roman amphitheaters. They are the exit passageways that allowed enormous crowds to rapidly discharge from the seating areas into the streets after events. The word comes from the Latin vomere, meaning to discharge or spew forth, referring to how these tunnels expelled large numbers of people efficiently, not to any gastrointestinal function. The Colosseum could empty 50,000 spectators in approximately 15 minutes using this system, which was a genuine feat of crowd management engineering. There is no credible archaeological or literary foundation for dedicated purging rooms at Roman dinner parties. Roman dining rooms, triclinia, were not equipped with adjacent vomiting chambers in any excavated example. Some Romans did reportedly vomit to continue eating at extended feasts. The philosopher Seneca explicitly criticized this behavior as morally degrading, which tells you it happened and that it was considered shameful, not standard practice. But it was a personal behavior, not a facility-supported architectural amenity that someone designed and built into the floor plan. The architectural term was used correctly in classical scholarship for centuries with its proper meaning. The popular misidentification appears to have solidified in the 20th century as rhetorical shorthand for Roman excess, circulated by writers who either didn't know the word's actual meaning or found the misidentification too useful to correct. The Romans were genuinely excessive in many well-documented ways. They threw extraordinary dinner parties. They did not build dedicated rooms for purging between courses. and there was absolutely no need to invent that detail to make the point about their indulgences. 10. The gladiatorial arena was a death factory. 2 men entered, 1 man left. The loser was executed while the crowd roared for blood, and Rome watched industrial-scale killing as the afternoon entertainment. This version of events is wrong in almost every specific detail that matters. Gladiators were extraordinarily expensive to train. A top fighter represented years of investment in specialized food, medical care, professional coaching, and equipment. Arena promoters paid for gladiators by the fight, and killing one meant absorbing a substantial financial loss that no competent business operation would accept as routine. The economics alone pushed strongly against routine death. Archaeological evidence from gladiatorial training schools shows sophisticated medical facilities and trained physicians on staff. Galen of Pergamon, one of antiquity's most significant physicians, began his medical career treating wounded gladiators and had consistent, complex casework. Fight records carved on walls at Pompeii show match outcomes with a notation system that includes M for misses, meaning spared or released, as a standard recorded result alongside victories and deaths. Referees called Summa Rudes and Secunda Rudes actively intervened during bouts to pause the action, enforce rules, and separate fighters. This is a regulated athletic contest, not a slaughter. A gladiator who lost but fought with visible effort could raise a finger to appeal for mercy. The crowd and the presiding official, not emperors at most events, would decide. Granting mercy when a fighter performed admirably was common and documented. Death rates in the arena are estimated by historians at roughly 1 in 9 to 1 in 10 bouts during the imperial period, significantly lower than the Hollywood version insists. The Roman arena was closer to a high-stakes combat sport with referees, medical staff, and crowd participation than a scheduled execution. Rome remembered the blood and forgot the rulebook, which was precisely what Rome's marketing department intended. 11. Julius Caesar was born by Caesarean section. It's right there in the name. The procedure is literally named after him. Except, this is one of those origin stories that the subject's own mother disproved by continuing to exist for decades afterward. In ancient Rome, Caesarean sections were performed only on women who were already dead or dying as a last attempt to save the infant. Aurelia Cotta was not only alive at Caesar's birth, she was a significant intellectual and political influence on his upbringing, remained active in his life, and died around 54 BC, when Caesar was in his mid-40s. A woman cannot be the subject of a life-saving posthumous surgical procedure and then spend the next 4 decades raising the child who supposedly required it. The surgical techniques necessary to perform a cesarean section on a living woman who could survive the procedure didn't develop until the late medieval period at the earliest, and reliable survival before the 19th century was extraordinarily rare even then. Roman law, the Lex Caesarea, did require that a child be cut from a dying mother in an attempt to save it, a procedure recorded in ancient sources as a recognized last resort. But this was an emergency intervention for terminal cases, not a standard delivery method for living women. The actual etymology of caesarean is genuinely debated among classical scholars. Competing theories include the Latin caedere, meaning to cut, an ancestor named Caeso, who was supposedly delivered this way, or simply a reference to the law itself. The direct Julius Caesar connection is the least supported of the available options. Pliny the Elder provides one of the earliest references linking the Caesar name to birth by incision, but Pliny wrote over a century after Caesar's death and was not consistently reliable as a biographer. The name Caesar also predates Julius by several generations as an inherited family cognomen. You named a major surgical procedure after a man whose own mother's survival schedule made the story impossible. 12. Julius Caesar, bleeding from 23 stab wounds on the Senate floor in 44 BC, looked up at his friend Brutus and whispered in Latin, "And you, Brutus?" A perfect, devastating farewell that history preserved for you. William Shakespeare wrote those words in 1599. No contemporary Roman source records. Caesar saying anything coherent after being attacked by 23 men simultaneously in a confined space full of panicking senators. The closest ancient account to a famous last statement is found in Suetonius, writing over 100 years after the assassination, who mentions one version in which Caesar reportedly said, in Greek, not Latin, "Kai su teknon," meaning "you too, child," and then immediately notes that this is unconfirmed and disputed even within his own era. Plutarch's account focuses on Caesar covering his face with his toga as he fell, behavior consistent with Roman Stoic ideals of dignified composure in death, not with delivering a carefully structured final address. 23 people stabbing simultaneously in a confined room, with senators panicking and fleeing in all directions, does not produce an environment that supports coherent final speeches. It produces chaos, screaming, and rapid collapse. Shakespeare almost certainly took the Greek fragment from Suetonius, adapted it into Latin for dramatic effect, and placed it in Caesar's mouth because it served the play's themes of betrayal, not because he had access to a better source than Plutarch. Et tu, Brute has been repeated so many times across so many media that most people assume it comes from a Roman historical record rather than from a playwright born 1,560 years after the murder. A playwright gave a dead man his most famous words 16 centuries after the fact, and the world cited it as a history. At this point, Shakespeare has more authority over how we remember Rome than Rome does. 13. Ancient Romans wore togas. That's the costume. Every Roman in every depiction, every film, every illustration wears one. It is their uniform. The problem is that togas were formal, ceremonial garments. Heavy, expensive, technically demanding to wear, and almost entirely impractical for daily life. Most Romans wore them rarely if ever, and some actively avoided them until the state stepped in to enforce the dress code. A toga was approximately 18 feet of heavy, undyed wool, wrapped around the body in a configuration that required another person's help to put on correctly, and that slipped constantly once on. Performing any physical work while wearing one was essentially impossible. Emperors Augustus and Claudius both had to issue decrees specifically requiring Roman citizens to wear togas in the Forum and at public games, which means Romans were actively avoiding their own supposed national garment, and the government had to legally mandate toga wearing at civic events. That is not the behavior of a population naturally committed to the garment. The common Roman daily wear was the tunica, a simple, belted, rectangular garment functioning like a belted shirt-length dress, practical, washable, layerable, and actually suited to the activities of daily life. Only male Roman citizens could legally wear a toga. It functioned as a citizenship marker as much as clothing, which is why its formal wearing carried social weight worth enforcing. Women wore the stola and the palla. Slaves, non-citizens, and the disgraced were prohibited from wearing togas entirely. Working-class Romans wore shorter, coarser tunics. Soldiers wore military dress. The toga was the formal suit of its era, appropriate for Senate appearances, legal proceedings, and major religious ceremonies, not for heading to the market, working in a shop, or doing anything that required functional clothing. Depicting every Roman in a toga is like depicting every modern person in formal evening wear. Technically, someone owns one. Almost nobody is wearing it to buy groceries. 14. After defeating Carthage in the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Romans salted the earth to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. The definitive act of imperial annihilation, the original scorched earth policy, made literal. The only problem is that no contemporary Roman source mentions it. The story appears to have been invented or substantially embellished by 20th century scholars, and then repeated until it achieved the false authority of a fact that has always been known. The earliest detailed description of salting Carthage's fields that historians have been able to trace appears in academic works from the 1930s, over 2,000 years after the event supposedly occurred. Appian, Polybius, and Livy, the primary ancient sources for the Punic Wars, describe Carthage being burned and demolished, its population killed or enslaved, and the city razed. None of them mention salt. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus reportedly wept as Carthage burned and quoted Homer. Not exactly the emotional register of someone simultaneously performing an elaborate agricultural curse ritual. Salting land as an act of deliberate destruction does appear in some ancient Near Eastern records and biblical descriptions of sieges, so the concept wasn't foreign to antiquity, but its specific application to Carthage has no ancient source basis. More problematically, for the myth, the Romans rebuilt Carthage as a Roman colonial city within a century of its destruction, initially under Julius Caesar and then developed further under Augustus, which makes any thorough agricultural poisoning of the territory directly counterproductive to their own colonial interests. Historian B.H. Warmington noted the absence of ancient sourcing for this story in 1964, but by then it was already entrenched in enough textbooks to have acquired the momentum of received truth. One of history's most vivid images of imperial revenge was apparently constructed in the 20th century and quietly inserted into antiquity. If you're going to fabricate a historical atrocity, perhaps don't pick one that the supposed perpetrators immediately contradicted by building a prosperous city on the site. 15. The losing gladiator looks up from the arena floor. The emperor considers. The crowd turns their thumbs down. Death is ordered. It is one of the most recognizable images in all of Roman history, reproduced across centuries of art and film. The direction of that thumb is almost certainly wrong, and the emperor's direct role in the decision is significantly overstated. The Latin term pollis verso, appearing in ancient sources as the signal for death, translates to turned thumb, but verso means turned without specifying direction. Up, down, or sideways are all grammatically consistent with the source. The actual gesture is genuinely ambiguous in the historical record, and scholars have debated it for generations without definitive resolution. The thumbs down means death convention was popularized by a single painting. French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme's 1872 work Pollis Verso, which depicted downward thumbs as the crowd's death signal. This painting became so widely reproduced that it effectively redefined the popular understanding of arena protocol across the entire Western world. Some classical scholars interpret the death signal as a thumb extended outward or thrust forward, symbolizing "give him the sword," while the mercy signal involved a closed fist with the thumb concealed, symbolizing "sheath the weapon." The crowd's role in the decision was genuine, but not absolute. The presiding official, the editor, held final authority. Emperors attended major games and sometimes intervened, but the image of a single emperor deciding every fight's outcome with a gesture is a dramatic compression of a more distributed decision-making process. Epigraphic and written sources confirm that crowd response influenced the outcome and that missio, mercy, was a recognized standard result. But the specific mechanics of the signaling system remain debated. One 19th century painter's artistic interpretation became the definitive historical record for most of the planet. At this point, Gérôme has more documented authority over Roman gladiatorial protocol than any actual Roman. 16. Classical Rome was a city of gleaming white marble. Pristine columns, luminous temples, clean stone statuary reflecting the rational clarity of Roman civilization. The aesthetic is everywhere, in museums, in neoclassical architecture, in every film set in antiquity. It is also what happens when 2,000 years of weather removes all the paint, and then an entire civilization decides the weathered result was the original intention. Ancient Roman marble structures and statues were painted in vivid polychrome colors, reds, blues, yellows, flesh tones, detailed patterns, that would look startlingly garish to eyes trained on 5 centuries of white marble is classical beauty, cultural conditioning. Chemical analysis and microscopic examination of ancient Greek and Roman statues has confirmed the presence of paint residues on surfaces that now appear bare stone. Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow ochre, cinnabar, malachite. The Elgin marbles show traces of polychrome pigmentation under ultraviolet light and spectroscopic analysis. They were never intended to be seen as white. The Gods in Color traveling exhibition has reconstructed dozens of ancient statues with their historically documented paint schemes, and the results are confrontationally colorful by modern aesthetic standards. Ancient Roman writers describe painted statues as a given. The idea of unpainted white marble would have read to a Roman viewer as unfinished work, the way an unprimed canvas reads to a contemporary art audience. The European Renaissance looked to classical antiquity for aesthetic inspiration, encountered the already faded, unpainted ruins, and concluded that unadorned white stone was the ideal. This error then propagated through 5 centuries of Western art, architecture, and sculpture with compounding authority. The preference for white marble became so ideologically charged, linked to concepts of classical purity that carried explicit racial undertones in later centuries, that the correction has been actively resisted in some quarters, even as the scientific evidence has become unambiguous. Western civilization built its most enduring aesthetic philosophy on ruins that had simply run out of paint. 300 Spartans stood alone at Thermopylae against a 1,000,000-man Persian army. Pure Spartan courage against impossible odds. The story is so clean and so perfectly structured that you should already be suspicious. There were somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 Greek soldiers at Thermopylae from numerous city-states. The Spartans held the celebrated final stand, but they were not the entire Greek force, and the Persian army was a fraction of the size the myth requires. Herodotus, the primary ancient source, lists contingents from Corinth, Thebes, Thespiae, Phocis, Locris, Arcadia, and others alongside the Spartans. The allied Greek force numbered approximately 6,000 to 7,000 at its peak. The Thespians deserve particular acknowledgement. When Leonidas dismissed most of the allied forces before the final stand, the roughly 700 Thespians chose to remain and fight. Every single one was killed. Their city was subsequently destroyed by the Persians as punishment for their resistance. Yet, 300 Thespians has produced no films, no graphic novels, and essentially no cultural memory, which tells you something important about how the myth was constructed and for whose purposes. The Persian army size figures from Herodotus, Orephons, over 1,000,000, with some ancient sources claiming 2.5 million, are considered implausible by modern military historians applying logistical analysis to supply requirements for forces that size. Scholarly estimates place the actual invasion force at between 100,000 and 300,000, still vastly outnumbering the Greeks, but a different order of magnitude from the myth's requirement. The strategic value of the narrow pass was that it neutralized Persian numerical advantage by removing the space needed to deploy that advantage. The impossible odds were deliberately engineered by Greek tactical choice, not simply absorbed through raw courage. 700 men from a city you've never heard of died at the same battle and received none of the credit. 18. The Spartan military machine was essentially invincible. Hardened by the most brutal upbringing the ancient world produced, Spartan soldiers were simply unbeatable in open combat, and their reputation alone was enough to win battles before the first spear was thrown. The reputation was real, the invincibility was not, and it was shattered so completely at a single engagement that Sparta never fully recovered. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC saw the Theban general Epaminondas defeat a Spartan army by deploying an oblique formation, concentrating overwhelming force on one flank against the Spartan elite while deliberately weakening his other wing. Approximately 400 Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, died in the engagement, representing a significant portion of their entire fighting population. Sparta never fully recovered militarily from a single afternoon's work by a general who read the situation and refused to fight on Spartan terms. Spartan military dominance rested on a dangerously narrow demographic base. Spartiates were a small elite within a larger society of Perioikoi, who were free non-citizens, and Helots, who were enslaved people. By the 4th century BC, the Spartiate population had contracted severely, making their legendary army increasingly difficult to field at meaningful scale. The agoge, the brutal Spartan training system, also produced some notable casualties through the training process itself, and boys who died during their education were simply removed from the record, which conveniently helped maintain the myth of producing only the exceptional. Sparta's Cryptia, in which young Spartan men were sent to hunt and kill helots as part of their military development, reveals an army whose internal security concerns consumed significant resources. The Spartan reputation was so carefully managed that losing commanders were sometimes prosecuted for cowardice, creating institutional incentives to record defeats ambiguously. Military propaganda has a shelf life. Spartacus expired at Leuctra, and the bill for his century of myth-making came due in a single afternoon. 19. Athens invented democracy. Real democracy, the genuine article, the foundational model for every representative government that followed. The Athenian system is the template on which modern democratic theory rests, and studying it means studying the origin of political equality. Except the demos who governed themselves in Athens was a privileged minority of adult male citizens operating on the excluded labor and political invisibility of the vast majority of people actually living in the city. Population estimates for 5th century BC Athens suggest approximately 250,000 to 300,000 total inhabitants. Of these, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 were eligible male citizens with political participation rights. Women, who constituted roughly half the citizen family population, had no political standing whatsoever. Not reduced rights, not limited participation, none. Athens in its democratic golden age had a larger enslaved population than it had citizens. Estimates suggest 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved people, comprising approximately 30 to 35% of total inhabitants. These people produced much of the material wealth that funded Athenian civic life, philosophical inquiry, and architectural achievement. Medics, foreign residents who might have lived in Athens for generations, spoken Greek fluently, paid taxes, and served in the military, had no political rights and limited legal standing. Athenian democracy also featured ostracism, a vote by eligible citizens to exile anyone they found politically inconvenient for 10 years, requiring no trial, no stated crime, and no formal accusation. Participatory governance as institutionalized mob veto. Socrates was sentenced to death by this democracy through a jury vote of 500 citizens for the charges of corrupting youth and impiety. The world's most celebrated democracy executed its most famous philosopher through its most democratic mechanism. Athenian democracy was a remarkable political innovation for a carefully defined minority, built on the excluded labor of everyone else. 20. The ancient Olympics celebrated pure athletic competition. Amateur athletes competing for glory alone, untouched by money, professionalism, or the corrupting influence of commercial incentive. The olive branch crown was the only prize. The purity of the contest was the point. This image of pristine amateur sport was invented by 19th century European aristocrats who needed historical precedent to exclude working-class athletes from the modern games they were designing, and they projected their class ideology backward onto antiquity with complete disregard for what ancient sources actually describe. Olympic victors received no prize money at Olympia itself. The olive crown was the formal award at that specific venue. What happened when a champion returned home was an entirely different financial conversation. Solon of Athens reportedly set the cash prize for an Olympic victory at 500 drachmas, roughly 500 days' wages for a skilled laborer. That is not symbolic recognition. That is a professional-level income event. City-states invested in promising athletes by providing coaches, dedicated training facilities, food allowances, and time to train, effectively creating state-sponsored professional athletes in everything but formal title. Some competitors traveled a circuit of major games, Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, and the Pythian Games, accumulating prize money and civic honors across multiple venues in a pattern that functions exactly like a professional tour. Professional trainers called Eleiptai and Paitotribai were a recognized occupational category, hired specialists who prepared athletes for competition as their primary livelihood. The amateur ideal of the ancient Olympics was a Victorian construction that the ancient Greeks never shared, never articulated, and never practiced. The ancient Greeks took winning seriously, rewarded it financially, supported it institutionally, and never pretended otherwise. You've been celebrating a version of the ancient games that the ancient Greeks would not have recognized and would probably have found baffling. 21. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of ancient knowledge ever assembled, was destroyed in a single catastrophic act. And in that one moment, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world was lost forever. Civilization never fully recovered from what was erased in a single burning. The library declined gradually across several centuries through funding cuts, political neglect, and multiple damaging events separated by hundreds of years. There was no single conflagration that erased antiquity's knowledge in an afternoon, and the library's cultural role has been significantly romanticized beyond what the institution actually was. Julius Caesar's fire during the Alexandrian War in 48 BC likely burned books stored at the harbor, possibly a warehouse rather than the library itself. And even this event is ambiguous in contemporary accounts. Howard Carter's work, this was not. The library went through distinct institutional phases. The famous Mausion was a research institution, while a daughter library at the Serapeum Temple had a separate history and a separate fate. Funding and political priority eroded the collections long before any fire. As the Ptolemaic kingdom declined and Rome absorbed Egypt, the institution lost its royal patronage, its budget, and its operational momentum over generations. The Serapeum was destroyed in 391 AD during riots following a decree against pagan temples, but the library had been in institutional decline for centuries before that, and whether significant collections remained at that point is genuinely disputed by historians. The Arab conquest story, Caliph Omar ordering the burning in 642 AD, appears in sources written hundreds of years after the fact and is considered largely invented. Much ancient knowledge survived elsewhere and was actively preserved in Constantinople, Antioch, Pergamon, and through Byzantine and Islamic scholarly traditions. The library didn't explode. It was defunded, which is a worse story and therefore the one nobody tells. 22. Ancient Greek art is defined by pure white marble, the unadorned stone aesthetic that inspired Western art for 5 centuries and that you can see in every major museum on Earth. That pristine whiteness is what the Greeks intended, and it represents their philosophy of idealized form stripped of distraction. It represents what happens when pigment weathers away over 2 millennia, and then an entire civilization looks at the result and decides the decay was the design. Greek statues were painted in detailed, realistic colors. Scientific analysis using ultraviolet fluorescence imaging, X-ray fluorescence, and raking light photography has revealed paint traces on dozens of major sculptures. Pigments including Egyptian blue, red ochre, yellow ochre, cinnabar, and malachite on surfaces that now present as bare stone. The Peplos core, a 6th century BC Athenian statue, has been reconstructed from documented paint traces showing red lips, colored hair, patterned clothing, and detailed irises. An image wildly different from the unadorned museum piece. Ancient Greek writers describe painted statues as an unremarkable given. The idea of unpainted sculpture would have read to a Greek viewer as unfinished work, the way an untreated surface reads to any craftsperson working in a tradition where finishing is the point. Chryselephantine cult statues, including Phidias's famous statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, combined gold, ivory, and painted wooden elements. The most revered religious objects in Greece were anything but monochrome. Renaissance artists who looked to Greece for inspiration encountered the already faded stone and elevated its weathered appearance into a philosophical ideal of classical restraint. an aesthetic built on accidental archaeology, not intentional design. Western civilization constructed its most enduring visual philosophy on a misreading of what ancient artists actually made. You saw unfinished work, called it perfection, and built museums full of it. 23. Vikings wore horned helmets. This is perhaps the single most universally recognized piece of Viking iconography, reproduced on sports team logos, theatrical costumes, cartoons, and film productions across more than a century of popular culture. It is also supported by essentially zero archaeological evidence from the actual Viking Age. Exactly one complete Viking Age helmet has been found, the Geirmundbu helmet, recovered in Norway and dated to approximately 970 AD. And it is a rounded iron cap with a nose guard. Practical, unglamorous, and entirely without horns. Bronze Age Scandinavian horned helmets do exist. The Vexo helmets from Denmark, dated to approximately 900 BC, are remarkable ceremonial objects. But they predate the Viking Age by over a millennium and were almost certainly ritual items rather than military equipment. Practical military reasoning eliminates horns from combat helmets with little effort. Horns create leverage that an opponent can grab to pull the helmet off or control your head. They snag on surrounding equipment, reduce peripheral vision, add weight with no defensive benefit, and serve no battlefield function whatsoever. The horned helmet image was popularized in the 19th century by Scandinavian nationalist romanticism and theatrical costume design, most influentially by Swedish artist Gustav Malmström's illustrations for an 1820 edition of an Icelandic saga. Richard Wagner's opera productions of the 1870s cemented the image in European imagination through costume choices that subsequent theatrical and cinematic convention then adopted without question. The image propagated through 20th century cartoons, comics, and films until it became so universal that correcting it feels like an attack on cultural memory rather than a straightforward factual observation. The most recognizable piece of Viking military equipment was invented by a 19th century opera costume designer. The actual Vikings, who were practical seafarers and raiders with functional equipment priorities, would have found a horned combat helmet operationally baffling. 24. The Vikings were a unified people. A Norse nation or coherent ethnic bloc with shared identity, coordinated leadership, and common purpose who raided, explored, and settled as a collective enterprise. The word Viking describes a people. It does not. It describes an activity. The Old Norse word vikingur referred to a person who went on a sea raid or voyage. It was an occupational term derived from a verb, not an ethnic designation. The majority of Scandinavians during the Viking Age never raided at all and would not have identified with the term. The people we collectively call Vikings were politically organized into dozens of competing chieftaindoms and early kingdoms across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and beyond, with no unified state, shared military command, or common political agenda. Norwegian Vikings predominantly raided and settled westward: Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Vinland. Danish Vikings oriented toward England and France. Swedish Vikings moved east, trading down Russian river systems and establishing settlements that became foundational to Kievan Rus. These were not coordinated divisions of a unified strategy. They were independent populations pursuing independent agendas in different directions. Norse groups in different regions developed distinct cultural and linguistic identities over generations. The Norse settlers of Normandy became the Normans, who invaded England in 1066, effectively fighting against other descendants of Norse settlers who had arrived in England in earlier waves. These were people with shared linguistic ancestry fighting each other under different political identities because they had been separate societies for generations. Political fragmentation among Norse chieftains was constant. Alliances shifted, kingdoms merged and divided, and individual leaders pursued independent goals that frequently conflicted with those of other Norse leaders. The unified Viking identity was constructed by 19th century nationalism, which needed coherent, ethnic ancestors for political purposes. Calling the Vikings a nation is like calling all pirates a country. It describes what some people from a region did on boats, not a political or ethnic reality. 25. Vikings were unwashed, matted-haired, malodorous warriors who had no meaningful relationship with personal hygiene. Barbarians in every sense, including the olfactory, whose appearance matched the brutality of their reputation. This is almost precisely backward. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings were unusually attentive to personal grooming by the standards of their era, and the written complaints of their victims are among the most entertaining confirmations of this in the historical record. Combs made from antler or bone are among the most ubiquitous personal items found at Viking Age. Archaeological sites across Scandinavia, Britain, and Iceland, appearing with a frequency that signals daily grooming practice rather than occasional vanity. A 10th century English chronicler named John of Wallingford complained, with evident frustration, that Danish Vikings were unfair competition with English men for the attention of English women, specifically because the Vikings bathed on Saturdays and combed their hair regularly. He found this deeply irritating, which tells you everything you need to know about the comparative hygiene standards of the era. The Old Norse word for Saturday is laugardagur, which translates to bathing day or washing day. A weekly bathing tradition was built into the language itself, not as a special occasion, but as a named, recurring cultural practice. Viking graves regularly contain small personal grooming kits, tweezers, razors, and ear picks, indicating these items were considered important enough to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites includes soap production residue, and Norse traders imported grooming products through their extensive trading networks. The filthy barbarian image was substantially a creation of the Christian monks and writers who documented Viking raids and had compelling reasons to portray their attackers as subhuman. The people who wrote the history were attacked by well-groomed raiders and chose to remember only the raid. 26. Viking warriors drank from the skulls of defeated enemies, a practice that established their fearsome reputation and confirmed just how savage and untethered from civilized norms these Norse raiders truly were. This story originated from a 17th century mistranslation of a Latin text, and the entire skull-drinking tradition that subsequently populated centuries of Viking imagery was built on a single dictionary error. The confusion stems from a 1636 translation of the Krakumal, a skaldic poem by Danish historian Ole Worm. The Latin phrase he produced, ex craniis eorum quos se siderant, was interpreted as from the skulls of those whom they had slain. The difficulty is that the original Old Norse term skal can refer to a bowl or vessel, not specifically a cranium, and the drinking horns central to Norse feasting culture were the actual referent in the poem. Ole Worm's mistranslation then moved through subsequent scholarship and popular culture with the accumulated authority of a fact no one thought to re-examine. Anatomically, a skull is a genuinely poor drinking vessel, small capacity, unstable base, no handle, and requiring significant structural modification to prevent leakage at multiple seam points. Practical considerations alone make routine skull drinking implausible as a widespread custom among people who also built functional longships and managed complex trade networks. Archaeological evidence does not support large-scale skull modification for use as drinking vessels in Viking Age contexts. Isolated examples of skull cups exist across various ancient cultures, but none are definitively Viking in origin or practice. The drinking horn was a genuine and culturally significant Norse feasting object, elegant, functional, and ritually charged, making the bowl interpretation of the poem entirely plausible within the material culture of the period. A 17th century translator made one vocabulary error and accidentally supplied every subsequent Viking film with his most memorable prop. 27. Iceland is lush and green, while Greenland is frozen and hostile, meaning the Vikings either mixed up the names by accident or deliberately mislabeled them to deceive potential settlers, protecting the good island by giving it the bad name while tricking people into colonizing the ice. The naming logic made geographical sense at the time, particularly for Greenland, which was significantly more hospitable in the 10th century during the medieval warm period. Iceland was named to discourage settlement. Neither name was a mistake. When Norse explorer Floki Vilgerdarson settled Iceland around 865 AD and experienced a difficult winter, he reportedly named the island after seeing fjords packed with drift ice from a mountain viewpoint. A literal description of what he observed in that specific season, and possibly an intentional deterrent to people who might otherwise crowd the limited agricultural land. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland around 985 AD, explored the island now called Greenland and named it during the medieval warm period, when temperatures in the North Atlantic region ran roughly 1 to 2 degrees warmer than later averages. The southwestern and western coastal areas he encountered were genuinely green and relatively productive for Norse agricultural methods. This was not deception. It was accurate coastal description of what he actually found. Norse Greenland sustained functioning agricultural settlements, the eastern and western settlements, for approximately 400 to 500 years, supporting cattle, sheep, and some crops. The name was not fraudulent. The climate changed around the settlers and eventually made their economy unviable, shifting the label from apt description to apparent paradox over several generations. Iceland's landscape, despite its name, includes extensive geothermal activity, hot springs, fertile valleys, and productive fisheries. The Vikings didn't get the names backward. The climate changed and made the logic look wrong retrospectively. 28. The Maya were a great civilization that mysteriously vanished. One day building cities and astronomical observatories, the next simply gone, leaving behind ruins and a disappearance that historians have spent centuries trying to explain. Approximately 7 to 8 million Maya people are alive today, living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Maya did not disappear. The word collapse refers specifically to the decline of classic Maya lowland cities in the southern Maya region between approximately 800 and 1000 AD. Not to the disappearance of Maya people, Maya culture, or Maya civilization as a functioning entity. Northern Maya cities, including Chichen Itza and Uxmal, continued to flourish well into the post-classic period, centuries after the southern lowland cities declined. Maya civilization did not end uniformly across the geographic region, and the regional decline that did occur has increasingly well-supported explanations rooted in environmental and political factors rather than mystery. Research points to a combination of prolonged drought documented in lake sediment records, sustained warfare between competing city-states, political fragmentation, agricultural overextension from population pressure and deforestation. A compounding system's failure with identifiable causes, not an unexplained vanishing. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan in the 16th century, they encountered living, politically organized, culturally sophisticated Maya societies that they then spent decades fighting in sustained military campaigns. The Maya didn't disappear. They were colonized through prolonged military effort by forces equipped with weapons they had never encountered, carrying diseases that preceded the armies themselves. The Maya writing system, calendar, and astronomical knowledge survived colonial suppression and are actively studied and practiced today by living descendants. The mysterious disappearance narrative serves a function of erasing indigenous continuity, rendering millions of living people invisible by treating their ancestors as a vanished ancient mystery rather than as someone's great-great-grandparents. 29. The Maya calendar ended on December 21st, 2012, and the Maya themselves predicted this date would mark the apocalyptic destruction of the world. A prophecy encoded by one of history's most sophisticated astronomical civilizations into their most complex calendar system. The Maya made no such prediction. The date marked the completion of a major calendar cycle called a Baktun, which Maya cosmology treated as a significant transitional moment deserving ceremony. not as a terminal boundary beyond which time itself ceased. The long count calendar operates on multiple nested cycles. The 13th Baktun ending was roughly equivalent to a large odometer rolling over, a numerically significant event requiring acknowledgement, not a cosmological stop sign indicating the end of everything. Maya inscriptions explicitly reference dates extending well beyond 2012, including one text from Palenque that mentions a date approximately 4,000 years in the future, which makes the calendar ends here reading difficult to maintain against the actual inscribed evidence. Contemporary Maya scholars, community leaders, and elders were vocal throughout the pre-2012 period about the misrepresentation of their calendar system. They stated clearly and repeatedly that the Baktun completion was not prophesied as an apocalypse, but as a cycle transition meriting celebration, and they were consistently ignored by the commercial enterprise that had already committed to the disaster narrative. The apocalypse concept itself was an import from Western eschatological traditions, specifically Christian end times theology, projected onto Maya astronomical mathematics, which contained no corresponding end-of-the-world cosmology. The 2012 industry was a Western commercial enterprise that appropriated Maya calendar terminology, stripped it of its actual meaning, and sold disaster preparedness products to people who couldn't read the source material. December 22, 2012 arrived on schedule. The Maya, had anyone consulted them rather than marketed them, would not have been surprised. 30, when Hernan Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II believed he was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, which is why he initially welcomed the Spanish rather than meeting them with military force. A case of theology overriding political judgment with world historical consequences. This narrative was constructed largely after the conquest by Spanish colonizers and their indigenous allies, and appears in sources written decades after the events themselves. Contemporary evidence that Moctezuma genuinely believed Cortés was a deity is extremely thin, and the story serves the interests of the people who wrote it far more than it reflects documented historical reality. The primary sources describing Moctezuma's supposed divine recognition of Cortés were written by the Spanish, including Cortés's own letters, and by indigenous informants working under Spanish colonial supervision years or decades after the conquest, all with strong incentives to frame conquest as divinely ordained or as voluntary indigenous capitulation. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Franciscan friar Sahagún in the 1570s, 50 years after the conquest, is the main source for the Quetzalcoatl prophecy narrative, compiled from indigenous informants working within a colonial context that shaped what they said and how they said it. Historian Camilla Townsend, among others, has analyzed these sources extensively and argues the Quetzalcoatl identification story was largely a post-conquest construction serving Spanish colonial legitimation and certain indigenous political purposes. Moctezuma's actual response to the Spanish arrival appears to have been complex political calculation, managing an unprecedented and ambiguous threat through diplomatic protocol while gathering intelligence, not theological surrender. The Aztec Empire was a sophisticated political entity that had sustained itself through military power and alliance management. The mistaken for a god narrative conveniently explains away the military, epidemiological, and political factors that actually enabled conquest. It requires that the conquered people were credulous rather than the conquerors being lethal, which is a more flattering version of events for exactly one party. 31 before European arrival, the Americas were a vast, untouched wilderness, a pristine natural landscape inhabited by scattered small populations living lightly on the land, a world effectively without history waiting to be discovered and put to use. Pre-Columbian America was home to hundreds of millions of people organized into sophisticated civilizations, large urban centers, and complex agricultural systems. The wilderness Europeans encountered was largely a depopulated landscape produced by epidemic disease that swept through indigenous populations ahead of many explorers' own physical arrivals. Population estimates for pre-Columbian Americas range from 40 million to over 100 million, a significant fraction of the world's total population at the time. The city of Tenochtitlan had an estimated population of 200,000 to 300,000 at its height, larger than any contemporary European city, including London. The Amazon rainforest contains extensive evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian modification, terra preta, which is human-made fertile dark earth, raised field agriculture across vast areas, extensive earthwork systems, and settlement patterns indicating large, complex societies operating throughout the region. Disease, primarily smallpox, measles, and influenza, swept through indigenous populations ahead of European exploration at staggering speed, killing an estimated 50 to 90% of some populations before those populations ever saw a European face. The emptiness Europeans described encountering was largely a post-epidemic landscape, not a pre-human one. Cahokia, in present-day Illinois, was a major urban center with a population of perhaps 20,000 people around 1100 AD, larger than London at the same moment, featuring massive earthwork mounds and sophisticated urban planning that required organized labor and administrative coordination. The North American Great Plains were shaped by millennia of indigenous land management, including controlled burning, that maintained the grassland ecosystems Europeans later found and assumed were natural. Explorers arrived at the aftermath of a continental catastrophe and concluded they had discovered wilderness. Walking through a cemetery and calling it an empty field does not make it one. 32. The Inca Empire, the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas, spanning the western length of South America, had no writing system, a remarkable limitation that distinguishes it from every other comparably complex ancient civilization and that historians have never satisfactorily explained. The Inca had quipus, knotted cord devices that encoded information and served many of the functions that writing serves in other civilizations, and which some researchers now believe may encode a form of language that remains only partially understood. Quipus are knotted cord devices made from cotton or camelid fiber in which the type of knot, its position along the cord, its color, and the spacing between knots all encode information in a structured system. Over 700 quipus survive in museum collections worldwide. The numerical encoding system is well established. Quipus recorded census data, tribute tallies, astronomical observations, and administrative records. The information infrastructure required to manage a continent-spanning empire across extremely varied terrain without written documents. A 2017 study by researchers at MIT and Harvard found evidence of non-numerical narrative content in quipus. Structural patterns suggesting narrative or phonetic encoding beyond simple arithmetic, though the full system remains incompletely understood. The Spanish colonial administration recognized quipus as functioning records from the beginning. Colonial courts accepted them as legal evidence, and the Spanish initially employed indigenous Quipucamayog, professional quipu keepers, as administrative personnel. They subsequently ordered the destruction of thousands of quipus on grounds of suspected pagan religious content, which means we are working with a substantially depleted sample of whatever information system these devices represented. The Inca also maintained historical and literary knowledge through specialized oral historians whose memorized accounts complemented the quipu records. We declared the Inca illiterate, then burned most of their record-keeping system, and now express puzzlement about why we can't read what's left. That is not the Inca's limitation. That is a crime scene. 33 Native American peoples lived in small, scattered tribal groups, nomadic or semi-nomadic societies without the cities, trade networks, or political complexity that defined civilized cultures elsewhere in the world. The absence of those things justified, in the legal and moral framework supplied by European colonizers, the appropriation of land that was being underused. North and South America contained numerous large urban centers, sophisticated trade networks spanning thousands of miles, and political organizations that rivaled old world states in structural sophistication. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was a planned urban center with a peak population estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people around 1100 AD. Its central Monk's Mound contains more earth by volume than Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza, and required sophisticated engineering coordination and organized labor to construct. The Mississippian culture that produced Cahokia maintained trade connections stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, moving copper, marine shells, obsidian, and other goods across thousands of miles through established networks. Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico contained massive multi-story stone structures built with documented astronomical precision, serving as ceremonial, administrative, and trade centers for a vast regional network that stretched across the Colorado Plateau. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois League, was a sophisticated political confederacy of 5 and later 6 nations with a constitution, representative governance mechanisms, and formalized decision-making processes. Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico reached a population of 100,000 to 200,000 around 400 to 500 AD, one of the largest cities in the world at that moment, with planned grid streets, multifamily apartment compounds, and specialized market districts. The primitive characterization of indigenous American societies was a colonial construction that served a specific legal and moral function, defining existing inhabitants as lacking the civilizational markers that would entitle them to property rights under European legal theory. The largest city in the world in 1100 AD was in what is now Illinois. 34 Hammurabi's Law Code, inscribed around 1754 BC, was a landmark of human rights. One of the earliest attempts to create equal justice under law, protecting the weak from the powerful through a system of consistent, universal legal principles that applied regardless of social standing. The Code of Hammurabi was an explicitly tiered legal system with different rights, different protections, and radically different punishments depending entirely on your social class. The same offense carried different consequences depending on whether you were a free person of high standing, a free commoner, or an enslaved person, and the code makes these distinctions without apology or ambiguity. The code recognizes 3 social categories: Awilum, who were free persons and nobility; Mushkinum, who were free commoners; and Wardum, who were enslaved people. The same assault, the same bodily harm, the same destruction produced completely different legal outcomes based solely on class membership. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of a free man, his own eye shall be destroyed. Law 198. If he destroys the eye of a commoner, he pays 1 mina of silver. Law 199. If he destroys the eye of a slave, he pays 1/2 the slave's assessed value. The famous eye for an eye principle applied fully only among social equals in the highest tier. It was a limitation on excessive revenge within the elite, not a universal protection extending to everyone. Women held some legal rights under the code, including divorce rights in certain circumstances and property ownership provisions, but remained legally subordinate within a framework defined by male authority. The stele on which the code was inscribed depicts Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from the sun god Shamash, framing the entire enterprise as divine mandate rather than human rights philosophy. The Code of Hammurabi was not a human rights document. It was a class stratified pricing schedule for bodily harm with a divinity endorsement on the cover. 35. Ancient China developed in near total isolation from the civilizations of Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world, a culture unto itself, producing its philosophical and technological achievements in independent separation from the rest of human history. China had active trade, cultural exchange, and technological transfer with Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and indirectly with the Mediterranean world from at least the Han Dynasty onward, through networks that moved goods, ideas, religions, and diseases across entire continents. The Silk Road trade network was operational by at least the 2nd century BC, carrying Chinese silk westward and Roman glassware eastward simultaneously. Chinese silk was being worn in Rome, while Roman luxury goods were reaching Chinese courts. Not as curiosities, but as documented trade commodities within a functioning commercial system. Buddhism spread from the Indian subcontinent to China through Central Asian trade routes, arriving by approximately the 1st century AD and fundamentally reshaping Chinese philosophy, artistic traditions, and religious life across subsequent centuries. The scale of that cultural import alone disproves isolation. Chinese records describe diplomatic contact with Rome, referred to as Da Qin, as early as 166 AD, when a mission describing itself as representing the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius arrived at the Han court. The Han dynasty maintained diplomatic relationships and sustained military engagement with states across Central Asia, fighting campaigns against the Xiongnu that affected the political balance across the entire Eurasian steppe system. Technologies moved in both directions through these networks. Paper and paper-making techniques developed in China reached the Islamic world by the 8th century AD and Europe by the 12th, fundamentally altering the information infrastructure of the receiving cultures. The isolation model was partly a product of later Chinese historical self-presentation during deliberately closed periods like the Ming Dynasty, applied retrospectively to earlier, more open eras. Ancient China was connected to the world by the busiest trade network on Earth. Calling it isolated is like calling the world's most active harbor a quiet backwater because someone removed the signs. 36. The Great Wall of China is so vast that it is visible to the naked eye from space. The only man-made structure large enough to be seen from orbit, a testament to the scale of ancient Chinese engineering achievement. The Great Wall is not visible from space with the naked eye, multiple astronauts have confirmed this directly, and basic visual geometry makes it impossible regardless of how many times the claim appears in textbooks. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, China's first person in space, reported in 2003 that he could not see the Great Wall despite specifically looking for it during his mission, a pointed piece of evidence given the considerable nationalist investment in the claim within China itself. NASA has addressed the question directly. The wall is too narrow to be resolved by the unaided human eye from low Earth orbit at approximately 200 miles altitude. For a structure to be reliably visible at that distance without optical aids, it would need to be roughly 70 miles wide. The Great Wall runs between approximately 15 and 30 feet wide. The claim of space visibility appears in published textbooks as early as 1932. 35 years before humans first reached space, which means it was speculative hyperbole that achieved the status of fact through repetition before anyone could actually test it. From low Earth orbit, large-scale human modifications, including cities, major highways, airports, and reservoirs, are far more detectable than the wall, which follows mountainous terrain and blends visually with the landscape it traverses. Under specific conditions involving fresh snow cover, optimal lighting angles, and photographic magnification, images from the International Space Station have captured the wall. But this requires optical assistance and ideal conditions, not the casual, naked eye observation the myth describes. The actual Great Wall is not one continuous structure, but a series of walls built by different dynasties across centuries, with gaps, parallel sections, and varying degrees of preservation. It is a remarkable engineering achievement that requires no impossible visual claims to justify your admiration of it. 37. The Silk Road was a single defined trade route connecting China to Rome. A road you could follow from one end to the other, a named highway with a consistent path that merchants traveled in continuous journeys from the Chinese capital to the Mediterranean coast. The Silk Road was a loosely connected network of multiple shifting overland and maritime routes, spanning thousands of miles with no fixed path, no central administration, and goods typically passing through many intermediary traders, rather than any single merchant traveling the full distance from origin to destination. The term Silk Road, Seidenstrasse in German, was coined by geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. The ancient traders who used these routes had no single name for the network and no unified conception of it as one road because it was not one road. The network included multiple overland branches navigating around the Taklamakan Desert, maritime routes through the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf, and northern steppe routes across Central Asia. Interconnected systems with different operators, different goods, and different political environments. A merchant in Chang'an typically sold goods to a Central Asian intermediary, who sold to a Sogdian trader, who sold to a Persian, who sold to a Byzantine. No individual person or organization managed the entire chain, and the final buyer had no direct knowledge of the original producer. The Sogdian merchants, an Iranian people from the region of modern Uzbekistan, were arguably the primary managers of Central Asian trade for centuries, yet they are almost entirely absent from the popular Silk Road narrative that focuses on Chinese origin and Roman destination as its two dramatic poles. Maritime routes through the Indian Ocean were arguably more significant by trade volume than the overland routes for much of the network's operational history. The name Silk Road is also misleading in commodity terms. Spices, glass, precious metals, enslaved people, horses, paper-making techniques, and entire religious traditions all traveled the same networks as silk. It was not a road. It had no silk at every waypoint. It was a system of middlemen who never met each other. 38. The Indus Valley Civilization, spanning parts of modern Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3300 and 1300 BC, was a modest prehistoric society, less developed than its contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, which is why it receives less attention in standard historical curricula. The Indus Valley Civilization was one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world, covering a geographic area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined at its peak, with city planning and infrastructure that wasn't matched in Europe for thousands of years after its decline. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had populations estimated at 20,000 to 50,000 people, large urban centers by any ancient standard. Mohenjo-Daro's urban planning included a grid street system, standardized fired brick construction throughout, covered drainage channels, and indoor plumbing connected to a city-wide sewage infrastructure. The sanitation engineering visible in this city would not appear in European urban contexts until the 19th century AD, a gap of roughly 4,000 years. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is a large, watertight public bathing structure demonstrating hydraulic engineering of considerable sophistication, constructed approximately 2,000 years before Rome's famous public baths. Indus Valley weights and measures were standardized across the entire civilization, the same measurement units appearing at sites separated by hundreds of miles, indicating either centralized administrative coordination or sophisticated inter-city agreement operating across vast distances. The Indus script, appearing on thousands of small carved seals, remains undeciphered, which is perhaps the primary reason this civilization receives less cultural attention than Egypt or Mesopotamia. We can read Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian cuneiform. We cannot yet read Indus script. The civilization that built functioning indoor plumbing 4,500 years ago is not primitive. It is simply one we haven't learned to read yet, and we keep treating those two things as if they mean the same thing. 39, before Columbus sailed west in 1492, everyone believed the earth was flat, and the great fear was that sailing too far would mean falling off the edge. Columbus's voyage proved the earth was round, settling a debate that had paralyzed geographical knowledge for centuries. Educated people in the ancient world had known the earth was spherical for over 2,000 years before Columbus was born. The ancient Greeks not only established that it was round, they calculated its circumference with remarkable precision using geometry and careful observation. Greek philosopher Pythagoras proposed a spherical earth in the 6th century BC. Aristotle provided empirical arguments for it in the 4th century BC, including the circular shadow the Earth consistently casts on the moon during lunar eclipses, an observation available to anyone who watches enough of them. Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria around 240 BC, calculated the Earth's circumference by measuring shadow angles at different locations on the same day and extrapolating geometrically. His result was approximately 40,000 kilometers, within 2 to 15% of the modern measurement of 40,075 kilometers, depending on which estimate of his unit of measurement you apply. This was not a lucky approximation. It was systematic geometric reasoning applied to careful empirical observation. The Roman scholars Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and Ptolemy all wrote from and worked within a spherical earth framework, as did medieval European scholars, including Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon. The myth that medieval Christians believed in a flat earth was largely fabricated in the 19th century by writers including Washington Irving, who invented Columbus's dramatic opposition to flat earth believers in a fictionalized biography that subsequent popular culture mistook for historical record. Columbus's actual dispute with Spanish scholars concerned the Earth's size, not its shape, and the scholars were correct. Columbus significantly underestimated the circumference. He survived only because an unexpected continent interrupted his miscalculation. He didn't prove the Earth was round. He proved you can survive being badly wrong about its size if geography cooperates. 40. Ancient people had a life expectancy of around 30 to 35 years, meaning that reaching 40 made you elderly by the standards of your time, and the ancient world was populated almost entirely by young people managing old bodies. The average life expectancy figure is pulled catastrophically downward by extremely high infant and child mortality. Adults who survived childhood could, and routinely did, expect to live into their 60s, 70s, and beyond. Life expectancy at birth and life expectancy conditional on surviving childhood are radically different numbers, and conflating them produces a completely misleading picture of what adult life actually looked like in ancient societies. In ancient Rome, life expectancy at birth was approximately 25 to 35 years. But this average incorporates the roughly 30 to 50% of children who die before age 10, mathematically dragging the average down to a number that implies universal early death without describing it. A Roman male who reached age 25 could statistically expect to live to approximately 52 to 55. A Roman who reached 50 could expect another 15 to 20 years of life ahead. The Roman Senate was structurally a gerontocracy dominated by men over 50, many over 60. The word senator comes from senex, meaning old man. An institution systematically dominated by elderly men cannot exist in a society where reaching 50 is a rare biological achievement. Cicero wrote his philosophical essay on old age, De Senectute, as a sustained meditation on managing later life at age 62, discussing what we now recognize as geriatric concerns. This makes no sense as a document if 62 were freakishly unusual. Skeletal analysis of ancient populations confirms that significant numbers of individuals reached advanced ages. Bone wear, dental erosion, and degenerative joint changes readable in the archaeological record directly contradict the universal early death narrative. Ancient people didn't think 35 was old age. They thought childhood death was a normal catastrophe. Those are different statements describing different realities, and only one of them is true. 41. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered the Dark Ages. Centuries of intellectual darkness, scientific stagnation, and cultural regression during which nothing of lasting value was produced, and the hard-won knowledge of classical antiquity was essentially lost until the Renaissance recovered it. The term Dark Ages is a pejorative invented by Renaissance scholars who needed something to look superior to by comparison, and the era it describes was intellectually dynamic in ways that the label was specifically designed to obscure. The Islamic Golden Age, running roughly from the 8th through the 13th centuries AD, produced foundational advances in mathematics, including algebra developed by Al-Khwarizmi, astronomy, medicine through Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which remained a European medical textbook until the 17th century, optics, chemistry, and philosophy. All during the same centuries that Western Europe is labeled intellectually dark. Byzantine civilization maintained Greco-Roman scholarly traditions continuously throughout the medieval period. preserving and copying classical texts that were later transmitted to Renaissance Italy. The Renaissance that supposedly ended the darkness was materially dependent on the scholarship produced during it. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries AD, under Charlemagne, produced significant scholarly activity, standardized Latin script, manuscript copying programs, and educational reform across Western Europe during what the standard timeline considers peak darkness. Irish and Anglo-Saxon monasteries became centers of manuscript production and preservation from the 6th century onward. The Book of Kells is a product of a Dark Age scriptorium representing artistic sophistication of the highest measurable order. Agricultural innovation during this period, the heavy plow, the horse collar, and the three-field crop rotation system, transformed European agricultural productivity and built the material foundations for later medieval civilization. Professional medieval historians rarely use the term Dark Ages today, precisely because of how profoundly misleading it is. It survives primarily in popular culture because it is convenient shorthand for a complex period that resists simple characterization. The lights were on. They were just in rooms that Renaissance scholars preferred not to credit. 42. Ancient people had no understanding of electricity or sophisticated mechanical technology. These concepts are entirely modern, products of the scientific revolution and the industrial age, and projecting them onto antiquity is the kind of romantic thinking that serious historians dismiss. Ancient civilizations demonstrated functional understanding of static electrical phenomena, constructed devices of astonishing mechanical sophistication, and in at least one case may have built a rudimentary electrochemical device that continues to generate scholarly debate. The Baghdad Battery, discovered near modern Baghdad and dated to approximately 250 BC through 250 AD, consists of a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. An arrangement that generates a small electric current when filled with acidic liquid. Its actual function is debated, but it demonstrates at minimum a sophisticated material understanding of component interactions. Thales of Miletus in the 6th century BC documented that rubbing amber with fur produced attractive force, static electricity. The Greek word for amber, electron, is the direct etymological root of electricity. This was not accidental observation, it was systematic natural inquiry producing a recorded, named phenomenon. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck dated to approximately 70 to 60 BC, is an ancient Greek analog computing device containing at least 30 interlocking bronze gears that calculated astronomical positions, eclipse cycles, and potentially Olympic Games scheduling. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity appears in the historical record until 14th century European clockwork, a gap of roughly 14 centuries. Roman concrete used volcanic ash to create a material demonstrably more durable than modern Portland cement, with harbor structures surviving 2,000 years of seawater exposure, while modern concrete degrades in decades. Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD described a steam-powered rotating sphere driven by jet propulsion, a functional demonstration of thermodynamic principles. Ancient people didn't lack the capacity to observe and work with these phenomena. They simply hadn't attached the theoretical framework we later developed around things they were already using. 43. Atlantis was a real, technologically advanced civilization that existed in the Atlantic Ocean and was destroyed in a geological cataclysm. A lost world whose ruins may still lie somewhere beneath the waves, waiting for the right expedition to find them. Atlantis was invented by the philosopher Plato in 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC as a philosophical allegory. There is no archaeological, geological, or credible historical evidence for its existence as a literal place, and the silence of every other ancient source on the subject is extraordinary given how significant a civilization the description implies. Plato is the sole source for the Atlantis account. No other ancient author contemporary with or earlier than Plato mentions Atlantis as a real location, which is a remarkable silence for a supposedly powerful maritime civilization that allegedly interacted directly with the ancient Mediterranean world. In Plato's account, Atlantis was described as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and as having been destroyed approximately 9,000 years before Plato's own time, placing its destruction around 9,600 BC. That is a period in which human civilization consisted of hunter-gatherer societies with no maritime empire capability whatsoever. The archaeology of that period does not contain an advanced naval power. Plato used fictional states throughout his philosophical works as thought experiments. The Republic's ideal city is explicitly a construct, not a place. Atlantis served a comparable allegorical function, contrasting Athenian virtue with Atlantean imperial overreach and the divine punishment that followed. Geological surveys of the Atlantic Ocean floor have produced no evidence of a sunken continent in any location Plato describes. Continental crust does not sink on the timescale the story requires, and the absence of geological signature is definitive rather than suggestive. The Atlantis industry, books, documentaries, underwater expeditions, merchandise, is a multi-million-dollar enterprise built on a single philosophical text that ancient readers understood as allegory. Plato would have found this either deeply flattering or deeply concerning. 44 ancient warships, particularly the famous Greek trireme, were powered by enslaved people chained to their oars below deck, whipped to maintain stroke rate, living in squalid conditions that defined the human cost of ancient naval power. Greek triremes were rowed by freemen, citizens, and hired laborers, and the economics, tactics, and politics of ancient naval warfare make the enslaved galley rower model essentially impossible for the vessels concerned. Athenian trireme rowers, called thetes, were the lowest property class of Athenian citizens, free men who received pay for their naval service. The fleet was a democratic institution with real political weight because Athens depended militarily on the rowing class, and that class knew it and used that leverage in political negotiations. Rowing a trireme at combat speed required extraordinary coordination from 170 oarsmen arranged across 3 staggered banks of oars. Acceleration, turning, backing water, and the devastating ramming maneuver all demanded skilled, motivated, trained rowers who understood commands and could respond with immediate precision. Chained, resistant workers with no investment in the outcome are catastrophically poor at precision-coordinated movement under combat conditions. The Cambridge-built experimental replica trireme Olympias, rowed by volunteer university students and academics without specialized training, achieved sprint speeds of over 7 knots, confirming the vessel's performance characteristics and demonstrating directly the coordination requirements involved. Roman Republican galleys also relied primarily on free rowers, though enslaved people were used in some later imperial contexts. The degree of slavery in Roman naval operations is debated, but always slaves, always chained is an oversimplification that collapses centuries of variation. The image of the chained galley slave pulling an oar to a whip's rhythm is drawn primarily from later Mediterranean galley practices, particularly Ottoman and European powers of the 15th through 17th centuries, and has been projected backward onto ancient Greek vessels by about 2,000 years. The Athenian navy that defeated Persia at Salamis was rowed by citizens who subsequently demanded political reforms as payment. 45, the Celts were a distinct ethnic group, a single people with shared cultural identity, common language, and unified heritage who spread across Europe before being pushed to the margins by Roman and Germanic expansion, leaving their descendants in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Celtic is a linguistic and cultural classification, not an ethnic identity. The people categorized as Celts never referred to themselves collectively by that term, and Celtic identity, as popularly understood, is largely a modern construction assembled by 18th and 19th century Romantic nationalism for political purposes that had nothing to do with ancient reality. The ancient Greeks used Keltoi to describe various peoples of Central and Western Europe who shared certain observable cultural features. It was an outsider's administrative category, not a self-designation used by those peoples in their own understanding of themselves. Celtic languages form a real defined linguistic family with Gaulish, Brittonic, and Goidelic branches. But speaking related languages does not constitute a shared ethnic identity any more than speaking Romance languages makes Romanians, Brazilians, and French people the same people. The ancient populations of Britain, Gaul, Iberia, Galatia in modern Turkey, and the Po Valley of northern Italy all fall under the Celtic umbrella in classical sources. An enormous geographic and cultural diversity compressed under one convenient label applied from outside. The ancient Gauls, the most classically Celtic of continental European peoples, left almost no written records because they were predominantly oral cultures, meaning virtually everything we know about them comes from Greek and Roman writers, operating with their own frameworks, agendas, and limitations as observers. The modern Celtic identity associated with Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and Galicia is substantially a product of 18th century Romanticism that selected certain cultural and linguistic relationships to construct a coherent ethnic narrative serving contemporary political needs. The actual people being described would have identified by tribe, region, and local political allegiance, not by a Greek administrative term for people who live somewhere in that general direction. 46 medieval plate armor was so heavy and encumbering that knights required cranes or mechanical assistance to mount their horses, and once knocked off their feet, could not rise without help. The definitive image of military technology that created its own tactical liability. A complete suit of plate armor, typically weighed between 15 and 25 kilograms, was distributed across the entire body through a fitted structure and was designed by skilled craftspeople specifically for mobility in combat. Knights trained in their armor and could run, mount horses unassisted, and fight effectively on foot, which was necessary because all of those things happened regularly in actual medieval warfare. Historical records and manuscript illustrations show knights mounting horses unassisted, competing in tournament. Melees on foot, and performing physically demanding activities in full harness, none of which are possible if the immobilizing weight narrative were accurate. The Metropolitan Museum of Art and comparable institutions have conducted demonstrations using historical armor replicas in which modern volunteers, without specialized training or conditioning, perform jumping jacks, run, and rise from a prone position without assistance. Weight distribution is the key variable. A well-fitted suit of plate armor distributes its load across the shoulders, torso, and hips in a manner similar to how a modern military infantryman carries 30 or more kilograms of body armor and equipment. The total burden is substantial, but the distribution makes it manageable in ways that concentrated weight is not. Plate armor was developed precisely because it offered better protection with better mobility than chainmail. The entire engineering objective was protective coverage without sacrificing the movement required for the combat scenarios it was designed for. The crane to mount the horse detail appears to originate from jousting armor, specialized extra heavy equipment designed for static mounted lance competition, not from the field armor worn in actual military operations. Training in armor from childhood meant knights developed the conditioning and muscle memory to operate within it as professional equipment. It was engineered for the activity. Concluding it was paralyzing is like concluding that professional athletes can't move because they wear protective gear. 47. The Iron Age replaced the Bronze Age because iron was a superior metal, harder, stronger, and more effective for tools and weapons, and ancient civilizations adopted it as a straightforward upgrade once they understood how to produce it. Early iron was actually inferior to high-quality bronze in several important respects. Iron's adoption was driven by resource availability, not by the metal's inherent performance advantages at the time of its introduction. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin that can be cast into complex shapes, takes a sharp and consistent edge, resists corrosion reliably, and was highly consistent in quality when produced by experienced smiths. Early smelted iron was often impure, inconsistent in carbon content, and brittle compared to well-made bronze. A downgrade in performance for a civilization that already had excellent bronze weapons and tools. The late Bronze Age collapse, occurring around 1200 BC, was a comprehensive systems failure across the eastern Mediterranean that disrupted the trade networks enabling bronze production. Specifically the tin trade, since tin is rare and concentrated in specific geographic regions including Cornwall, Afghanistan, and Anatolia. When the tin supply network collapsed, along with the palace economies that managed it, experimentation with the more geographically accessible iron ore deposits accelerated out of economic necessity rather than metallurgical preference. Iron ore is abundant and widespread. Tin is rare and concentrated. Iron's ultimate competitive advantage was accessibility, not initial quality. The development of carburization techniques, adding carbon to iron during smelting to produce steel, gradually overcame iron's early quality limitations, but this refinement required centuries of accumulated experimentation after iron's initial adoption. Different regions adopted iron at different rates based on local resource availability and existing trade relationships, meaning the transition was a patchy, economically driven process, rather than a simultaneous recognition of superior technology. Early civilizations didn't choose iron because it performed better. They chose it because they couldn't get the ingredients for the thing that performed better. Bronze's retirement was a supply chain crisis, not a performance review. 48, ancient warfare was chaotic and unsophisticated. Two armies running at each other and engaging in undifferentiated violence until one side broke. Primitive compared to modern military thinking driven by brute force rather than tactical intelligence, and interesting primarily as spectacle rather than as a subject of serious strategic analysis. Ancient military commanders developed sophisticated tactical systems, deception strategies, logistical frameworks, and psychological operations that are studied in military academies today not as historical curiosities, but as functional models. Epaminondas at Leuctra in 371 BC invented the oblique attack, concentrating overwhelming force on one flank while deliberately weakening the other. A tactical principle that influenced military theory from Philip II of Macedon through Napoleon Bonaparte across 23 centuries. The Macedonian combined arms system, phalanx infantry fixing the enemy while cavalry delivered decisive flank attacks simultaneously, was a coordinated combined arms approach that Alexander used repeatedly to defeat armies substantially larger than his own. Sun Tzu's The Art of War, written approximately in the 5th century BC, is a systematic treatise covering strategy, deception, intelligence gathering, supply chain management, and psychological warfare that military and business professionals continue to read and apply as practical guidance. Roman military logistics were extraordinary. The Roman army moved with a supply system capable of sustaining tens of thousands of soldiers across thousands of miles, constructed paved roads specifically for military mobility, and built fortified overnight camps called castra at every stopping point, an engineering and administrative achievement requiring institutional competence of a high order. Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae in 216 BC encircled a numerically superior Roman army of approximately 80,000 soldiers through precise tactical coordination, killing an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 in a single afternoon. The maneuver is still taught at military academies as a model of tactical execution. Ancient battles weren't undifferentiated violence. They were the product of professional military institutions with doctrine, logistics, intelligence systems, and tactical frameworks refined over generations. 49. Ancient people had uniformly terrible teeth. A dental health nightmare before modern dentistry, fluoride, and professional care produced the oral health standards we take for granted today. Pre-agricultural populations in many ancient cultures had dramatically better dental health than modern people, and the primary variable explaining the difference has nothing to do with dentistry. It has to do with refined sugar, which is an industrial age invention that ancient populations did not consume in anything approaching modern quantities. Dental analysis of pre-agricultural human skeletal remains consistently shows low rates of cavities, minimal tooth loss, and healthy gum structure. A hunter-gatherer diet of meat, nuts, fruits, and vegetables did not provide the sustained fermentable carbohydrate environment that cavity-causing bacteria require to thrive. The adoption of agriculture, particularly grain cultivation, deteriorated dental health measurably. Starchy, carbohydrate-rich diets provided exactly the substrate that Streptococcus mutans and related bacteria exploit to produce the acid that destroys enamel. Roman soldiers' teeth, analyzed through archaeological skeletal evidence, show patterns consistent with their grain-heavy military rations. More cavities than a predominantly meat-based diet produces, but dramatically less decay than post-sugar populations. Ancient dental care existed and was sophisticated for its era. Egyptian papyri document dental treatments and preparations. Romans used abrasive tooth powders and dental picks, and Greeks and Romans both employed scrapers for oral hygiene. Archaeological evidence of tooth drilling and filling exists in multiple ancient cultural contexts, indicating organized professional dental intervention at a meaningful scale. The explosion of dental caries in the modern historical record correlates precisely with the mass introduction of refined sugar as a widely consumed commodity, spiking sharply in European populations after the expansion of the sugar trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ancient people didn't have better teeth because of superior dental care. They had better teeth because they hadn't invented the thing that destroys teeth yet. The refinement and mass distribution of sugar is arguably the single largest dental public health event in history, and we scheduled it deliberately. 50 ancient people drank wine and beer constantly, including at breakfast, because water was universally contaminated and too dangerous to consume safely. Alcohol was not a cultural preference, but a survival necessity, the only liquid option available to people without modern water treatment. This is a significant oversimplification that doesn't survive contact with what ancient people actually built and actually wrote. Romans constructed an aqueduct system of extraordinary scale precisely to deliver clean, flowing water to their cities. At its operational peak, Rome's aqueduct network delivered approximately 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a city of roughly 1 million inhabitants. An infrastructure investment of enormous cost and complexity that makes no sense if the delivered water were considered unfit to drink. Ancient texts from Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Mesopotamia distinguish carefully between good and bad water sources, with writers describing preferences for clean spring water and expressing awareness of the dangers of stagnant or polluted sources. This is the behavior of people who consider water a variable quality resource to be evaluated, not a universally dangerous substance to be avoided. Greek wine was heavily diluted with water, typically 3 to 5 parts water per part wine, producing beverages with very low alcohol content. Drinking undiluted wine was considered a marker of barbaric behavior in Greek cultural understanding. The wine as water substitute practice produced mild, nutritious beverages, not intoxicating replacements for a feared liquid. The alcohol sterilizes water logic has practical limits. The dilution ratios used in ancient wine consumption did not produce alcohol concentrations high enough to reliably neutralize pathogens in contaminated water mixed into the cup. Water sources were actively managed in ancient cities, wells were maintained, springs were protected, and contaminated sources were identified through observation of associated illness patterns. Ancient people drank wine because they cultivated grapes, enjoyed the result, and found fermented beverages nutritionally valuable. They built aqueducts because they also wanted clean water and were willing to pay the engineering costs to get it. 51 ancient megaliths, the pyramids, Stonehenge, Puma Punku, the Easter Island Moai, were so technologically demanding that ancient humans could not have built them without outside assistance. The only explanation that accounts for the scale and precision of these structures is extraterrestrial intervention in human development. The ancient aliens hypothesis is not only unsupported by a single piece of physical evidence, it is an insult to the engineering ingenuity of the actual human civilizations that built these structures, and it carries troubling patterns in which civilizations it selects for the too advanced to be human treatment. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that ancient construction methods were fully capable of producing these structures using available materials, organized human labor, and the physical principles accessible to careful observers. Researchers have moved multi-ton stones using wooden sledges, ropes, lubricated tracks, and coordinated teams without any technology unavailable to ancient builders. The Moai of Easter Island have been demonstrated through archaeological experiments to be movable in an upright walking motion, rocking from side to side using ropes and relatively small coordinated teams. Oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people describe a functionally similar technique. Stonehenge's bluestones were transported approximately 200 miles from Wales through a combination of human labor, sledges, and possibly water transport. Remarkable logistics, but logistics achievable by organized human effort without external assistance. The ancient aliens framework applies with suspicious selectivity. European megalithic structures like Karnak, Avebury, and Newgrange rarely attract the same impossible without aliens framing as Egyptian, Mesoamerican, or South American structures. That pattern reflects assumptions about which ancient peoples were capable of sophisticated achievement, not anything in the structures themselves. The hypothesis also contains a logical contradiction. If ancient humans needed alien help to build monuments, what were those same humans doing while simultaneously developing agriculture, writing systems, legal codes, astronomical calendars, ocean navigation, and metallurgy without any documented alien assistance? Every structure attributed to alien intervention has plausible, documented human construction methods. The aliens are what you reach for when you've decided in advance that the humans couldn't have done it, which says everything about the assumption and nothing about the evidence. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.